Good morning. How are you guys? I'm going to be introducing your speaker for today, Sandy Robbins. I met Sandy almost 15 years ago. I walked into this little fellowship in El Toro, California, hoping to make some changes with my life that was not going well at the time. And she has been a friend and a spiritual mentor ever since. And obviously I'm not very well because she had to follow me across the country to keep an eye on me. For real. And that was about 10 years ago that she's been out here. And she has a long life, not just in ages, but in experiences of how she got here today. And I'm sure you'll enjoy what she has to say.
Thank you, Shirley. She wasn't kidding about that. You know, we all have a plan, and I don't know if you've heard that phrase that we make plans, God laughs. I had Shirley's going away party at my house in Southern California, not knowing that less than 6 months later I was going to be transported across this country and end up in North Carolina, which was what, I think 6-hour drive. And so she ended up being my lifeline for a while, because when things were happening up there in the mountain that I wasn't too happy with, I'd jump in my car and run back down here to Virginia to spend time with her. So everything happens for a reason. And that took me many years to get to that point in my life where I was able to accept that all things happen for a reason. I was, you know, as I often say, that I spent the first 26 years of my life unconscious. I had no idea why I was here or what it was all about. And, you know, I finally ended up in a place where people started asking those questions. I'm trying to think now, it's almost 38 years ago. There were people that brought me to all kinds of workshops. I mean, I went to, in Southern California, I was blessed to see Marianne Williamson and Doreen Virtue and Deepak Chopra and all these people, and they all kept asking the same thing, and they all kept saying, you know, asking that question, who am I? Why are we here? And, you know, and I never had a clue. And I liked the message that I kept hearing, you know, change your thoughts, change your life. Change your beliefs, change your life. And I was like, well, what am I thinking? What are my beliefs? You know, why am I here? And so I had to start, you know, for me, I had to start at the beginning. I had to try to figure out the, you know, my parents, because I lived at that point with so much shame, guilt, fear, doubt. I had no, you know, the thought of being, you know, God was not in my, vocabulary at that time. So people that worked with me at that time had to start at my level. You know, and then jokingly, because I was said to have been dyslexic, they said things like, well, dog does for you what you can't do for yourself, you know, and that worked for me. I could accept that, you know, dog does for me what I can't do for myself. And God was good, orderly direction. I had to learn how to just take good, orderly direction, because I didn't like this whole idea at that point. You know, so at 26, I had to start with the basics. I had to, you know, spirituality was not a word in my vocabulary. So in going back and looking at my life and looking at the choices, I didn't realize I had choices. There was a lot of stuff in the news some years ago. I'm sure some of you will remember, like the Menendez brothers, that, you know, I was abused, so they went off and did terrible things. And we had the Susan Smiths that were using what I call the abuse excuse. And at the time, I was a drug and alcohol counselor, and I had worked in the field, you know, for 25 years. And I wanted to put my story out there of hope, that we have other choices, that we can go within. We don't have to continue to go without. And so backing up, I'm just going to give you a little bit of the history, and that's kind of what led me to writing my story, to get it out there, because I heard my whole life, well, they're just kids, or they won't remember. And I would always overhear adults talking and whispering, and, you know, and no one would ever explain anything because, well, we're just kids. What do we need to know? And so I like to say that, yes, we do remember. And most of us remember a lot more than we're given credit for. Both of my parents were rageaholics, were alcoholics, and we were passed around. I had 5 brothers, and we were passed around just from one family member to another because neither one of my parents were capable of taking care of us. And I never knew from moment to moment where I was going to be living. And I spent mostly I would get dumped off at Grandma Cicero, and she was my favorite grandma. You know, she was always in the kitchen cooking and, you know, preparing. This woman had 10 children of her own. So I had a lot of aunts and uncles. I have 35 first cousins, you know, so and that's just on my father's side. I don't even know how many on my mother's side. So a lot of, you know, whenever I would ask questions in the family, the answer always came back, why, you writing a book? And, you know, it was like, okay, so maybe they planted that seed. I don't know why I had to go on and tell that story. So in the beginning, I got passed around, and I did that, and at age 7, one day my father showed up, piled me in the car with a few of my brothers, and drove us off. You know, we thought we were going out for ice cream. And instead, I ended up in this facility for the next 3 years, where these people were all dressed in black, and they had the little white collars and the white collars here. And I had never, you know, seen. And my one brother was always the one that could break the ice. He was always cracking jokes about everything. And he said, "Hey, look at all the penguins." And I had never seen one before. I had no idea where we were. And my father literally dropped us off at a Catholic orphanage and drove off. And I wasn't to see him again for 5 years. So for the next 3 years, I learned all, you know, it was my first introduction. At age 7 was the first time I ever even heard people say God. I'd heard the word Jesus said in a bad way, but I'd never heard, you know, people talk about spirituality. And so these little, you know, penguins were running around. There were 30 of us in a cottage. And we were told literally when to wake up, when to sleep, when to eat, when to brush your teeth. Everything was done very military style. And I, you know, was sent to church every Sunday and mass during, you know, we had all kinds of stuff going on in that place. And one day I was informed by my social worker that I was going into a foster home. And again, nobody ever says, you know, what's going on. It's just this is what's happening. And I kept saying, but my parents aren't dead. Why do I have to go? Why, you know, I want to, you know, it's just, you just do what you're told to do. And so I ended up in my first of 2 foster homes. And it was just, you know, questioning everything. I mean, this woman that took me into her home was a very lovely person. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, and she had a baby there that had cerebral palsy, and people would, you know, she'd introduce me as this is our daughter, and I would think, do all adults lie? Like, can they not see that I'm not her? You know, that's where my head was at that point in time. And so I stayed there until that baby died, and then social workers felt it was best that I be placed in another home. So without any explanation, they just packed up my bag, and one day I was moved off to another foster home. I stayed with that family for about a year. And at least in this family, the match fit a little bit better. And I know a lot of people say these things don't matter, but I'm just telling you from the child's perspective what I went through. I don't feel that way today. But I was happy to be there because now I was getting at least Italian food, and she was cooking homemade bread and doing some of the things that, you know, I really enjoyed. But, you know, they didn't realize why this nice, quiet, shy person would leave in the morning and this little tyrant, angry person would come home after school. And I found that one other kid in school who was living in a broken home, that's what we called him, and her dad, she lived with her dad, and he had a really nice stocked bar. And so we found that heading over there after school and hitting that cabinet and watering down his booze, because of course he'll never know that we're watering it down. And so I started drinking at that age. It was just a way to take the edge off. And you know, I did have to go back and make amends to all these people later in life. So I was there, and one day came home. There's a strange car in the driveway. My mother was there. Hadn't seen her in a while, and apparently she had figured out a way to get custody of us back. So 3 of my 5 brothers, we went home with my mother that day. There was no goodbyes, so everything just changed and kept changing. So I'm now living with my mother, who's bartending nights, and sometimes she came home and sometimes she didn't. And then the wars would always begin. We would get thrown in the car and go from Cleveland to Pennsylvania. My mother knew every back road between Cleveland and PA without ever getting on a freeway. And we would always stop, those red neon signs, tavern, tavern. And we were told to sit in the car and be quiet. So we'd sit in the car and be quiet. When she would come out that door, she'd have her, chips and candy bars and covered the basic food groups. We were fed. We're going to Grandma's house. And once I got up to my grandmother's house, I'll back up a minute. She would always have a different driver. And you didn't dare ask Mom who the driver was, because, it was always Uncle Bob, Uncle Tom. She would meet these different people who would offer to drive her and her 3 kids the rest of the way, but they only managed to make it to the next bar, and then they'd get out and run for the hills. That went on for about a year. My dad was missing. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. Whenever we asked the adults well, where is he? He's away. Okay, well, where is he? He's at college. And I didn't know until much later that when they referred to going to college, that meant that he was in prison. And when he came home from college, with those black shiny shoes and a probation officer, that's when we started putting the pieces together. And now I was, picked up one more time and moved, and now I'm living with my dad and my grandmother and aunt and uncle. It was in Cleveland, and life was just one day at a time survival. We didn't think about tomorrow or next week or next year. It was living in the moment. Where are we going to be tonight? And I think later on in life I changed that tune. There was that Papa was a rolling stone. I changed that to Mama's a rolling stone. Wherever I lay my head is my home. Because I didn't know from one moment to the next where I was going to be living. I one day was put on a plane and sent out to California. My brother had just gotten home from Vietnam and picked up a wife in a bar, and 3 weeks later they drove across country, and somehow they made arrangements for me to go and live with him. And I'm now living, I was 14 years old and I just moved to Southern California. My first day at school, some kids were, looking at me. Now, Southern California in the late 60s. I had on a black leather coat down to my knees. I had black leather boots coming up to the other side of my knees and long straight hair. And some girl said, "Wow, what a bitchin' coat." And I thought she was calling me that other B word. So I took the coat off and I beat her up. That was life in Ohio. They even had a T-shirt, Cleveland, you gotta be tough. And so that started me on my first counseling session. I went to, and they wanted to know why I was so hostile or why I was so angry. And from the background that I came from, if you didn't throw the first punch, you were going to get punched. So I just was doing what came natural to me. And so I'm very grateful to say that through many years of drinking and drugging, I managed to find a life for myself that was so totally different. And I like the theme about bringing more joy into our world and our life, because that was a new concept for me. When I started working on I had to look at all these things that had happened and why they were happening. It took a long time for me to start I had this what we call euphoric recall. I remembered things to be a certain way, and it took a long time for me to start seeing the paradox that what was true at one level is not at another. And these were things this was new perspectives for me that I did not know until I got into recovery and started, I remember the first time someone took me to Calvary Chapel in Southern California, and they had like 10,000 people showing up for the Easter Sunday services, and we were getting baptized off the cliffs of, Corona del Mar. But one of the services, they were talking about Jeremiah, and I started singing "Jeremiah was a bullfrog." So I was not the easiest person. My heart was so hardened that it took a lot of people, a lot of prayers, and a lot of patience to work with me. and to keep telling me that, that I don't have to live that way anymore, that I have other choices. These were new concepts for me. So, I don't know, just learning how to stay in the moment was always such a challenge. I'm so grateful to the many people that were able to work with me and to help me along the way. Speeding forward, I ended up, 2 marriages that didn't work out, and 33 years ago I met the husband that I'm now married to, and it was a whole different life, because at that point I started learning about go within or go without. I learned I had to do an inventory on my life. I had to do an inventory on my belief systems, so that I couldn't change something if I wasn't even aware of what it was. I didn't realize how negative and how hardened I was at that point. And when I started looking at my story, looking at my parents, accepting that they did the best they could with what they had, that was a hard concept for me to take in the beginning. But looking back and realizing that their choices, it gets passed on from one generation to the next. And I didn't just inherit their color of my eyes or hair, I inherited their belief systems. So I had to look at, when I had judgments or I had said things, I had to stop and think, is this me that's thinking that, or is this something that was passed on from one generation to the next? What do I need to let go of? Is this serving who I am or who I want to be today? And I have to continue to take those personal inventories, because every now and then I slip back into that old thinking, what's the use, what's the point? And I have to breathe in and breathe out. Some of the people that know me get tired of hearing me say that, but breathing, inhaling, and exhaling have been the number one thing that have taught me how to stay grounded, how to stay in the moment. When my head starts racing, when I start going down the rabbit hole of what's the use and no, it doesn't matter, nothing changes, I bring it back to that breath, and I bring it back to grounding out that negative energy and saying, okay, that, and today I can say God, and I can say source or spirit. I didn't know how to have a personal relationship with a God of my understanding, one that loves me, and that I'm not alone, that none of us are alone, and that there is a plan. I found this Fellowship of Inner Light 4 years ago when I got here. I'm going to tell you how I got to Virginia, because I spent 25 years in the same house in the same location with my husband, and then one day, through life's changes and choices, he decided we were moving. And I was like that cat, this is how I do change, holding on with every, I don't want to do that. But so within, I don't even know, a 10-year period, we moved from California to North Carolina, and then I was here in Virginia. I got a phone call through a series of events. I ended up living out in the desert for 4 years. And 4 years ago, prior to coming here, I was out in that desert, and that's where I really had 4 years with the beautiful sunsets, the stars at night. I had a lot of time on I had no family, no friends, I was just out in the desert by myself, living in this senior community, which was fun. It had its benefits. But, it's like one day I finally, after doing a lot of soul searching in that desert, and I said something to the effect that, really, God, Jesus only spent 40 days and nights out in this desert. I've been here for 4 years. Whatever this lesson is, could it please be over? And 1 hour later, a van pulled up in front of my house, and this woman said, "Hey, do you know anybody who has a 2-bedroom house for sale around here?" And I jokingly said, yeah, you can have mine for the right price. And that was on a Tuesday morning at 9. Thursday, I'd signed papers. She handed me a cashier's check, and on Saturday, I drove out of there. Now, there's not enough time in the 20 minutes, but I was just trying to figure out how to condense this so it makes sense. The husband and I had been separated for that 4 years, and so we were texting each other occasionally, and so all this just happened. And so when God works in mysterious ways, he can work really fast too. So I was taught, watch what you put out there, because you may get it. And so I'm packed up my car and I'm driving out, and I sent him a text and said, well, I sold the house. I'm not sure where I'm going. I'll call you when I've landed. And he mentioned that he had a house here in Virginia Beach, and if I, wanted to come and stay for a few days or whatever, that I could do that. And so I've been here for 4 years. If you had told me that we were ever going to get back together, that would have never happened. That is God doing for me what I can't do for myself. And in search for, my spiritual family, I was led here to this fellowship, and I was great. There was a lot of things, and there is always a plan. Had I not come back here at that point in time, my brother, who I was very close to in Ohio, was diagnosed with glioblastoma. I would not have been here that last year. Still. Anyway. This guy reminds me so much of him. Cynthia. I haven't been that emotional in a while. Since last night, when I mentioned another friend of mine that passed on the other side. Cynthia helped me through that period of letting go of my brother. Just 2 days ago, I got a call or a letter from a friend of mine in California that a very dear friend just passed. So I'm still processing that. Sometimes I say, really, God, why are all these people getting to go and I'm still here? The beliefs that I've come to in the last so many years of my life here is I do believe in miracles. I've seen so many miracles, and I've seen so many lives changed. For me not to go down the same rabbit hole with my parents, my dad died at 48 and an alcoholic. My oldest brother was 38 when he passed, took his own life. My youngest brother Sam was coming home from the bar at the wrong time, wrong place. At 48, he got hit and killed by a drunk driver. So Ron, that man spent 16 years in a prison cell. He was a gift also. He was finally diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. And I remember one time in one of his psychotic moments, he looked at me and he said, "Sis, aren't you glad it was me that was chosen to live out the dark side and not you?" So out of the mouth of babes is what I would say, because this, he had such a, he was one of the people that turned me around on some of our childhood stuff. Aren't you glad we had an orphanage? We had a roof over our head and food on the table. And, there's a lot of kids living on the streets that don't have that. So that changed my perspective, looking at things differently and looking for the miracles, looking for the light in each other. Sometimes my head still wants to go to judgment, and I have to keep breathing in and breathing out and, ask myself to hear with God's ears, to see with God's eyes, to speak with God's words. And that's what gets me through. And we just keep on going. I really thank all of you for listening to me today. I wanted to put a message of hope out there if possible. If you know anyone who might benefit, I do have some books in the back that I brought today for $10, and all proceeds will go to the Fellowship of Inner Light because they've helped me so much on my journey. Thank you.